what it might mean for our government and our citizenry as the whole nature of work starts to shift. I'm sure many of you took Uber here today. Well, that's pertinent. So, Arun, please.
Okay.
I know I did.
All right. Thank you, David, for that really generous introduction. Over the last decade, we've seen the emergence of a wide range of on-demand, peer-to-peer sharing economy services that are starting to create viable substitutes for goods and services delivered through traditional firms, traditional institutions across a wide range of industries. And so many of these examples are familiar to us. Kickstarter for philanthropic crowdfunding, AngelList and CircleUp for equity crowdfunding, Funding Circle and Kiva for peer-to-peer lending, a whole host of accommodation, short-term accommodation alternatives ranging from a couch on Couchsurfing to an apartment on Airbnb to high-end home in London through One Fine Stay, traditional Korean home through Kazaza. Many of us took Uber here today, and what's interesting to me is that we're starting to see personal services extend beyond someone coming to pick you up in a car through your Uber or your Lyft or your Sidecar or Ola in India or Halo around the world. There's a set of diversified, personal services platforms that have emerged. Handy, HomeJoy, Job Runners, TaskRabbit will sort of send home a variety of service providers ranging from home cleaning to someone to repair your, sort of do home improvement, to organize your apartment, to do your accounting. And very recently, we've seen these personal services sort of ramp up a notch where, if you don't want to ship your stuff yourself, you take a picture of it through the Ship app. Someone will come and pack it up for you and ship it for you. If you want something picked up locally in an hour, Postmates will go and get it for you. It's sort of like a modern day version of that .com era, anything delivered in an hour company, Cosmo. If you don't want to park your own car, Lux will send a valet to where you are by tracking you on GPS and park your car for you. Once you get home, like Washio would have done your laundry and sort of delivered it to you. Munchery will send you a meal. If you're not feeling well, Heal will send you a doctor. If you want to relax a little more, Zeal will send you a massage therapist. If you want to relax even a little more, Drizzly will send you alcohol. And then there's my favorite, Ease, that will give you on-demand medical marijuana. Which my friends in Manhattan tell me is not a new app, but that's just sort of, I have no personal information about that. So this sort of motivated the Wall Street Journal to publish this cartoon a couple of weeks ago. And this is where the conversation about the on-demand labor and personal services seems to be on these personal services and concerns about haves and have-nots. But it's expanding further into the corporate market as well through software provided by companies like WorkMarket, through companies like Universal Avenue that will provide you a Salesforce on demand, or Hourly Nerd that will provide a management consultant with an MBA on demand. And so, there's a whole bunch of policy issues that are raised in different industries by these different platforms. I'm not going to be touching upon the crowdfunding issues today. I'm focusing more on consumer protection and labor issues that come up, largely from the platforms, Airbnb, Etsy, and these wide variety of services. And so as we transition from an economy that seems to be largely driven by institutions providing services to individuals to an economy where there are communities of different kinds, largely market-based and peer-to-peer, but also other forms of sharing communities that are giving us the things that we need, these consumption goods. A first question that comes to mind is, how sustainable is this? I mean, this particular round of platforms has largely been created by the consumerization of digital. We've got these powerful sort of GPS-enabled, high-speed network-enabled computers that we carry around, and they're letting us sort of re-engineer the way that we consume and get services and borrow. But there's this sort of ongoing digitization of the physical as well, right? Where maybe in the distant future, autonomous cars and like your Uber driver will no longer be a driver. But in the interim, like, the stuff that we own sort of knows where it is and can tell us like, how much it's being used. And so as blockchain technologies lower the transaction costs and sort of allow us to create marketplaces where a profit maximizing platform may not have gone in because there's not enough profit potential, this dramatically expands the scope of both peer-to-peer services and of peer-to-peer rental. There's a set of socioeconomic drivers that seem to sort of be behind this trend as well. People like a lower ecological footprint, densely populated urban areas favor this kind of peer-to-peer service. And we seem to have evolved to a point where we are willing to trust semi-anonymous peers based on some combination of trust signals, like maybe a digitized government ID, some information about their Facebook profile, feedback from other people, perhaps a mobile number. And so this combination of digital signals has gotten to the point where we are going beyond the eBay-like, I trust this person to send me a package, and we're moving to much more high-stakes interactions, where we are willing to say, I'm going to get into a stranger's car and be driven to another city. And my favorite example of the digitization of trust, and also one that sort of frames the policy issues to come, is BlaBlaCar, which recently acquired a wide variety of players in Europe, including carpooling, which was its largest competitor. BlaBlaCar facilitates the selling of empty seats in cars that are going from one city to another. Okay, and this sort of illustrates some of the traffic flow on that network. This is from a couple of years ago. And these are all people traveling from one city to another in Germany using sort of spare capacity in existing cars. And it really amazes me that at this point, the BlaBlaCar network carries more people every day than Amtrak does. And they've done it without any new investment in steel and concrete, sort of creating this kind of invisible infrastructure powered by this digital trust. What they also highlight, and to me, at the center of a lot of the policy issues, both on consumer protection and on labor, in this sort of emerging sector of the economy, is the blurring of lines between personal and professional in the provision of for money or commercial services. I mean, the idea of lending your apartment to someone, or giving someone a ride from the airport, or preparing someone a meal, or lending someone money for them to be able to start their own business, these are not new ideas, but they were largely in the personal realm. And then on the commercial side, you had taxi drivers, people who ran bed and breakfast, people who ran restaurants, and banks that lent you money. So what the sharing economy, the on-demand economy has done is that it's blurred the lines between personal and professional, leading to issues of how do we protect consumers when their provider is not a professional certified driver, leading to issues of how do we count the jobs that are being created, leading to issues are we sort of entering an economy where people are sort of assembling work as piecework rather than having stable full-time jobs. So I want to spend the rest of my time highlighting what I think are some of the important policy issues raised by this new sort of this emerging sharing economy. The first observation is that there are a wide variety of new self-regulatory opportunities that are created because you now have a platform that is mediating what used to be a peer-to-peer service without any sort of third party. So in the past, if you took a taxi, you needed the government in between in order to sort of provide some sort of safety, otherwise people wouldn't get into a taxi. Now you have a platform in between. And it's not just the platforms, there are other sort of third-party entities that have emerged, that have existed for a long time, like homeowner associations, that are emerging, sort of worker unions for sharing economy providers. And so it's always been my position that when thinking about a new regulatory framework for these different exchange of goods and services, that we have to think beyond the government and think about whether there are self-regulatory, which doesn't mean no regulation, it doesn't mean deregulation, it just means the regulation is executed and perhaps even conceived by an entity other than the government. And so, in a few months ago, I published a paper in the University of Chicago Law Review that took a look at sort of like the history of self-regulation and what opportunities it provides for the sharing economy. And I distinguish between two kinds of self-regulation. I mean, there's one where, there are information failures. You don't know the quality of your provider. You don't know the quality of the space that you're going to be staying in. You don't know if the person who you're lending to has been vetted. The platforms seem extremely well equipped to take on a large fraction of the regulatory responsibility that used to need the government for these kinds of information failures. Adverse selection, where the market fails because you're not clear about quality. Moral hazard, where you worry about sort of someone who borrows your thing treating it in a way that sort of like, isn't consistent with what they agreed to. Platforms are good for this kind of self-regulatory approach. On the other hand, there's a wide variety of old and new externalities that are also created. For instance, we've always been worried about congestion caused by too many cars on the road, too many sort of taxis on the road. There are new externalities like, your neighbors might be upset if you host on Airbnb and your guests are sort of throwing parties. There are strangers walking around the building. So for some of these externalities, it seems like, for example, for the Airbnb externality, it seems likely that a good path forward is to not involve the government, city or state, perhaps not involve the platform, but to delegate this responsibility to the homeowner association where the externalities are in fact sort of localized and where buildings can make a choice, like Airbnb free versus Airbnb friendly. Now turning to sort of like the labor side of the policy issues, there are two narratives playing out now when people talk about sort of the unbundling of employment and the creation of these on-demand services. One is the narrative of the empowered entrepreneur, where people were stuck in sort of these jobs that they didn't like and now are free to sort of pursue their dreams. These platforms are gateways to entrepreneurship. They're like finishing school for entrepreneurs, since universities don't teach you how to start a company. You can sort of dip your toes in the water and get a sense for merchandising, pricing, sort of running a small business. So that's one narrative. The other narrative is the race to the bottom narrative, where there's a worry that somehow wages will be depressed, people won't have income stability, the middle class will be hollowed out and will be left with a society with like a few million haves and hundreds of millions of have-nots. Now, of course, both these narratives are right. And the question really is, to what extent is each going to play out in different sectors, and what are the policy actions we can take to sort of move this in the direction that we want to? So I've been doing a lot of research on this front. I found, for example, that TaskRabbit wage rates on average are far higher than the BLS wage rates for those categories in the geographies that they're operating. I found that providers tend to be sort of far more entrepreneurial than the average sort of member of the US population, which suggests sort of more selection of entrepreneurs into this economy. I built an economic model and did an extensive study of projecting what happens when peer-to-peer rental markets go mainstream. And one of my findings, calibrating it to the automobile industry, was that there were welfare gains that were captured disproportionately by people below median income. Why? Because these are the people who were excluded because the barrier to ownership was too high. These are the people who will switch from owning to renting because the costs of carrying a car, for example, are too high and they would rather sort of rent when they need it. And these are the set of people who will buy better cars in order to rent them out on the peer-to-peer market. Because they can then use the extra income to afford a higher car payment or a higher home payment. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with three key policy issues around labor. One is that as we unbundle employment, we need new categorizations for employment. We've got independent contractors on one side, and we've got full-time employees on the other side. And there is this belief that somehow full-time employment is the desired outcome. That is not going to be realistic in the economy of the future. So we need more fine-grained categorization of employment so that we don't have these two extremes and platforms sort of hesitating to offer benefits to one extreme for the fear that perhaps they will then be categorized in the other extreme. We need to count employment better because work is not going to be measured as whole jobs, but is instead going to be measured in terms of output. And so unemployment statistics are no longer capturing sort of the health of employment in the economy. And we're going to perhaps, over the next few years, see the emergence of worker cooperatives that start to subsume some of the privately owned platforms. And if you think about, like, Thomas Piketty's book from last year, where he sort of demonstrates to us that the true sort of driver of inequality in the economy is the fact that owned capital grows faster than the economy on average, while wages only grow at the pace of the economy. That if we start to increase the fraction of the economy that are owners of what they produce, of sort of productive capital, then we might sort of end up in an economy where there is less inequality. And finally, in the United States, the social safety net is largely predicated on full-time employment with a large institution. It's really imperative, and I've seen sort of efforts from Capitol Hill and elsewhere to sort of start to address this problem, but it's really imperative that we create a new social safety net where things like, sort of income stability, paid vacations, workers' compensation, like, sort of long-term disability, all of these things that are bundled with employment now are somehow freed from it and available to people who participate in the on-demand economy. So that's all I've got. This is where you can find me if you want to learn more. Thank you for your time.